Today, we talk about the endless days of Bramblewood. The village of Bramblewood woke slowly, as it had for decades, centuries even, though no one counted. The river moved quietly, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the gray-blue morning sky. A few ripples traveled across the water as a fish disturbed the surface, then all became still again. In the smallest cottage near the riverbank, a woman opened her eyes. The sun had barely risen, yet enough light had crept through the thin curtains to make the room pale and soft. She stretched, slowly, bending one knee, then the other. Her hands lingered on the wooden frame of the bed. Nothing needed rushing. There was no urgency in Bramblewood. Nothing ever demanded urgency. She moved to the window and looked outside. The street was empty. The cobblestones were wet with dew. A cat sat on the fence across the way, licking its paw, then pausing to stare at nothing. She watched it for a long time. The cat twitched its tail slowly, deliberately. Then it wandered down the fence and disappeared into the morning mist. In the kitchen, she lit a small fire in the stove. The kindling caught with a quiet crackle. Smoke curled toward the ceiling in thin, twisting ribbons. She placed a pot of water on the stove, and it began to heat gradually. Steam rose in small, lazy clouds. Outside, the village bell rang once, far off, then fell silent. Across the street, the baker emerged from his shop. He moved slowly, carrying a basket of flour. Each step was measured. He swept the dust from the doorway, then carefully arranged the sacks of grain. His movements were repetitive, soothing, unhurried. Occasionally, he paused to watch a leaf fall from the tree in front of the shop. It twirled, then landed softly on the cobblestones. He picked it up and tossed it gently into the gutter. Along the river, a fisherman untangled his nets. His fingers moved slowly, knot by knot. The river reflected his quiet, repetitive work. Occasionally, a bird would skim the water, causing a small, circular wave. He ignored it. He had done this many mornings, and he would do it many mornings more. The sun climbed higher. Its light touched the rooftops, warmed the stones, and made the river glint. Shadows lengthened, then shrank as the light moved. A girl walked by, carrying a basket of herbs. She paused several times, sniffing the plants, adjusting them, then continued her slow journey. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured. The hours passed without notice. The villagers moved through their routines, sweeping, cooking, mending, carrying, washing. Every sound was soft: the crackle of fire, the splash of water, the quiet shuffle of feet on stone. The day expanded and contracted without excitement. No one spoke loudly. No one hurried. Everything was ordinary. Everything was unremarkable. And yet, in the unremarkable, there was a strange comfort. By mid-morning, the sun had risen fully. The river sparkled faintly in the light. Smoke rose from chimneys in gentle streams. The village continued its slow breathing. Somewhere a clock ticked, though no one listened. Time passed, softly, steadily, endlessly. Evening would come as it always did, and the cycle would repeat. But for now, in this quiet morning of Bramblewood, nothing stirred beyond the gentle rhythm of life, and that was enough. The sun climbed higher over Bramblewood, spilling pale lights onto the cobblestones. The village had awoken slowly, and now the day continued with deliberate calm. Nothing rushed here. Even the wind seemed to drift lazily. Along the main street, the blacksmith hammered quietly on a piece of iron. The sound rang softly, not urgent, not sharp, just the dull rhythm of metal meeting metal. He paused often, wiping sweat from his brow, then lifting the hammer again. Sparks danced briefly, then vanished. A small dog slept nearby, occasionally lifting its ear at the faint noise, then settling back into its nap. Nearby, the apothecary arranged herbs on wooden shelves. Each leaf, each bundle, was placed slowly, carefully in its proper spot. A cat prowled among the jars, brushing against them and leaving a trail of tiny paw prints on the floor. No one hurried. Everything had its pace. By the river, a woman washed clothes in a large basin. She dipped each piece slowly, squeezing it, letting the water drip between her fingers. The river gurgled softly beside her. Occasionally, a leaf floated past, catching her attention for a moment, then moving on. Her motions repeated, unbroken, predictable. A few children wandered along the banks, skipping stones. Each stone took several attempts to land flat, and each attempt was slow and deliberate. They laughed quietly, softly, then returned to the task. Nothing was urgent, and nothing mattered beyond the small motions of their hands and feet. In the square, the baker placed fresh bread on a wooden table. He dusted the loaves with flour, moving his hands slowly. The smell of warm bread drifted through the air. A passerby paused to inhale the scent, then continued on their way without hurry. Every step in Bramblewood was measured, every action gentle and unremarkable. Time moved forward softly. Shadows shifted slightly as the sun crossed the sky. The river reflected the light, sparkling faintly, then dimming as clouds drifted. A villager paused to watch a bird land on a branch, then continued sweeping the steps. Another paused to listen to the wind rustling through the trees. Small moments repeated endlessly, forming a slow rhythm that tied the village together. By mid-afternoon, the day seemed to stretch forever. Villagers moved from one task to another, but nothing was urgent. A woman hung laundry to dry. A man repaired a wheel on a cart. A boy carried water in a small bucket. Each motion was deliberate. Each breath was quiet. The world of Bramblewood seemed to expand, holding all its inhabitants in a long, soft pause. Evening was far away, but the village already felt timeless. The river continued its gentle flow. Leaves swayed lazily in the wind. The sun's light softened, touching everything with a muted glow. And in Bramblewood, everything was as it should be, unhurried, quiet, endless. The sun had finally disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving Bramblewood bathed in soft twilight. The sky was a pale wash of violet and gray, and the river reflected the colors faintly, like a mirror that had forgotten how to shine. The village streets were emptying slowly, not because anyone rushed home, but because the natural rhythm of the day demanded stillness. In a small cottage near the river, a woman lit a candle. Its flame flickered, casting gentle shadows that danced on the walls. She moved slowly, carefully, placing the candle on the wooden table. The wax dripped in tiny streams, and she allowed herself to watch it for several moments before continuing. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, but even it seemed to tiptoe, respectful of the village's quiet. In the main square, the baker closed his doors and leaned against the cool stone wall. He traced the outline of a carved pattern on the doorway, pressing his fingers into the grooves and letting them linger there. The smell of bread still hung faintly in the air, comforting and familiar, though the day's warmth was fading. A cat stretched along the steps, its back arching slowly before it settled into a ball, eyes half closed, observing the empty street. The blacksmith had cleaned his workshop and was now sitting on a bench outside, resting his arms on his knees. The hammer rested beside him, silent and still. He listened to the distant sound of the river and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. The evening was long, and there was no hurry. Each breath he took was deliberate, each blink unhurried. Even the passing clouds seemed to float with patience, reluctant to leave the sky. By the river, a fisherman secured his small boat to a post. The rope creaked softly as he tied it in a knot, then another, each one slow and deliberate. The boat bobbed gently, carrying the memory of movement from earlier in the day. He ran a hand along the wooden side, feeling the smooth, worn texture of decades of use. Then he sat on the riverbank, letting the water lap at his feet quietly, feeling the coolness seep in, unnoticed except for its calm weight. In the village gardens, a few women finished their chores. One carried a basket of herbs and placed it carefully on the windowsill, where the moonlight caught the green leaves. Another watered the last of her vegetables with a slow, steady stream, letting each drop soak into the soil. Occasionally, a leaf would float by on the wind, and she would pause to watch it settle, turning the action into a moment of quiet observation. The children had long since returned home. Some peeked from windows, watching the river and listening to the gentle chorus of crickets beginning their song. Others sat beside their parents, learning to fold cloth or sort tiny stones, their movements deliberate and slow, just like everything in Bramblewood. No one rushed, no one complained. Everything moved with measured patience. As night deepened, small lights flickered in the windows of cottages. The smoke from chimneys rose in thin, twisting columns, disappearing into the night sky. The village exhaled, soft and unhurried. The river reflected the moon's pale glow, the water moving slowly as if it too respected the pace of life here. Every sound was quiet, every motion gentle. Even the wind seemed cautious, brushing softly across rooftops, letting the village sleep without disturbance. In the distance, the forest whispered. Leaves shifted and branches swayed, but no bird called, no animal made a sudden sound. The night was calm, uninterrupted, stretching endlessly over Bramblewood. The villagers moved from one tiny task to another, a door latched, a candle extinguished, a blanket smoothed. Each gesture was repeated with care, slow enough that the eye could follow it entirely, small enough that it became part of the rhythm of the night. And so the village rested. Time continued its quiet march, unnoticed, unimportant. The river flowed, the trees swayed, shadows stretched and shrank as the moon passed overhead, and in the heart of Bramblewood, everything was exactly as it should be, endless, peaceful, deliberate. The day had ended, but life continued, softly, endlessly, in the same gentle rhythm it had always known. The village of Bramblewood lay quiet under the soft glow of the moon. Shadows stretched across the streets, curling around cottages and fences, drifting slowly like smoke. The river reflected the pale light, its surface shimmering faintly, barely moving, carrying the gentle rhythm of night. Inside a small cottage, a woman stirred in her sleep. Her breathing was calm, slow, measured. On the wooden table beside her bed, the candle had burned down to a tiny stub, leaving a faint scent of wax in the room. Outside, a cat padded silently along the roof, its movements careful, deliberate. No sound disturbed the deep hush of the village. The blacksmith slept on his bench, leaning against the doorway of his empty workshop. The hammer lay beside him, untouched. The night air was cool, brushing over his face and hands. Somewhere nearby, a branch shifted, a leaf fell, and he stirred slightly, but did not awaken fully. The rhythm of life in Bramblewood moved even in sleep, unhurried, unnoticed, eternal. By the river, the fisherman's boat rocked gently in the faint current. The rope creaked softly as it swayed. He slept in the small shelter nearby, his chest rising and falling slowly. Occasionally, a small wave lapped the riverbank, a tiny sound swallowed by the calm night. Fireflies drifted near the water's edge, blinking softly like distant stars that had fallen closer to the earth. In the gardens, a few small animals moved through the undergrowth. Rabbits stepped quietly over roots, mice scuttled among the stones. Each movement was careful, measured, part of the same slow rhythm that filled the village. Even the wind moved differently at night, slower, softer, as if it did not wish to disturb anyone. The children dreamed in their beds, some of rivers and trees, some of catching floating leaves, some of counting small pebbles along the banks. Their small breaths mingled with the calm night air. Somewhere, a mother turned slightly, smoothing the blanket over her child with careful hands. Each gesture, each breath, each movement was part of the endless, deliberate pattern of Bramblewood life. The baker slept in his room above the shop. The smell of bread lingered faintly even in the deep night, and the door to the shop was closed with slow precision. The fire had burned down completely in the oven, leaving only the quiet memory of warmth. His dreams were gentle, repetitive, filled with soft golden light and the faint rustle of flour sacks. The apothecary's windows glowed faintly with moonlight. Inside, the shelves of herbs and jars stood still, untouched. He slept in a hammock near the wall, rocking slightly as his breath rose and fell. Outside, the trees swayed lazily. A branch brushed the window with a soft scratch, then moved on. No sound carried far, no motion disturbed the calm. As the night deepened, the river's gentle flow seemed almost imperceptible. Each ripple, each wave, each reflection became part of a quiet rhythm, like a heartbeat in slow motion. The village itself seemed to breathe as one. Houses, trees, animals, people, river, all moving together in a long, unhurried pattern. In the forest beyond, owls sat silently on branches, watching the empty paths. Leaves shifted, twigs snapped softly under the careful step of an unseen animal. Even the dark held no urgency, no disturbance, only the same endless, peaceful pattern that Bramblewood had always known. And so the village rested, wrapped in darkness, yet alive with the soft, repetitive motions of night. Every breath, every creak, every ripple of the river became part of the quiet symphony of Bramblewood. Time moved, softly, slowly, unbroken. Nothing happened suddenly, nothing mattered urgently. Life continued deliberately, endlessly, as it always had and always would. The night stretched on, shadows lengthened and shrank under the pale moonlight. Every window, every street, every tree became part of the same gentle, boring rhythm. And in this deliberate stillness, Bramblewood slept, dreaming, flowing, moving softly in the endless days that never truly ended. Before the sun rose over the hills, Bramblewood lay in a soft, shadowy stillness. The river flowed quietly, almost without sound, reflecting the faint light of the stars. Mist hovered over its surface, curling slowly and drifting like thin smoke, as though the night itself were reluctant to end. In a small cottage near the eastern edge of the village, the first faint noises of the day began. A rooster crowed, softly, almost hesitant, as though unsure whether the morning had truly arrived. Its echo stretched across the empty streets, fading slowly into the mist. A woman stirred beneath her blanket, turning slightly, inhaling the cool, damp air. She did not rush. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the world wake slowly around her. The riverbank began to move imperceptibly. A fish surfaced, making tiny concentric ripples. The fisherman, awake but not yet leaving his shelter, watched the motion and adjusted a rope on his boat. The water lapped gently against the hull, rhythmic and soft, part of the quiet music of the pre-dawn. Along the main street, cats stretched and padded carefully from fences to rooftops. Their movements were deliberate, calculated. A few birds chirped lightly, low and infrequent, as though testing whether the world was truly awake. The villagers' windows glowed faintly with the first candlelight. No one hurried. Each flame flickered gently, spilling soft warmth onto the stone floors within. In the bakery, the baker had begun the first steps of his morning work. He opened a window to the cold, damp air, inhaling slowly. He sifted flour carefully into bowls, measuring with deliberate attention, the dust rising like a gentle fog. The bread would bake hours later, but the process itself was long, slow, and exacting. Every gesture was repeated, measured, unhurried. In the gardens, dew clung to leaves and flowers. A woman carrying a small bucket of water moved from plant to plant. She poured the water slowly, letting it soak into the soil. Every drop seemed important, every leaf worthy of attention. Occasionally, a small rabbit would peek from under the fence, sniffing the air, then disappear again without a sound. The blacksmith was already outside, walking slowly to stretch his stiff limbs. His bench awaited him, but he did not sit yet. He listened to the wind moving through the trees, the soft lap of the river, and the occasional gentle creak of a door. Every sound was magnified in the stillness of early morning. Even the smallest noise seemed loud when everything else was so quiet. By the river, mist twisted around reeds and stones. A lone bird glided low over the water, wings barely moving. The fisherman finally rose, stretching deliberately, and began preparing his nets. Each knot was untied slowly, each loop carefully examined. The river responded softly to his movements, ripples passing lazily along the surface. Children, still asleep, began to shift in their beds. One yawned slowly, stretching arms above their head. Another rolled over, adjusting blankets. The sound of small feet moving quietly across wooden floors soon joined the faint chorus of pre-dawn, the whisper of clothes rustling, the creak of doors, and the soft shuffle of slippers on stone. Every motion was unhurried, almost ceremonial, part of the village's daily rhythm. The mist began to lift, revealing rooftops, fences, and the winding streets. Light remained soft and gray, filtering gently through the trees. Shadows moved gradually across stone walls, changing imperceptibly as the sun inched higher. The village seemed to hold its breath, savoring the slowness, letting the world stretch without urgency. And so, Bramblewood began another day. The river flowed, the wind whispered through the trees, and villagers moved with careful deliberation. Every small action, sweeping a doorstep, tending to plants, adjusting a roof tile, stirring a pot, was part of the endless, patient rhythm of the village. Time passed slowly, unnoticed as the cycle of life continued in its calm, unremarkable, hypnotic way. The day had begun, but no one rushed. In Bramblewood, every moment was long, every gesture deliberate, and every day was quietly, endlessly the same. The morning sun had risen fully over Bramblewood, casting pale, golden light across the cobblestones and river. Shadows stretched long, then shifted gently as the sun climbed higher. The village, having stirred slowly in pre-dawn, now moved in quiet rhythm, each villager following the unhurried pace of their daily life. In the bakery, the baker worked steadily. Dough was kneaded slowly, folded with care, and set aside to rest. Flour dusted the air and the counter in soft clouds. He paused occasionally to watch the river through the open window, noting the gentle ripple of water and the glimmer of sunlight on its surface. No one hurried. Even the smell of fresh bread seemed to float lazily through the air, taking its time before reaching the next street. In the apothecary, jars clinked softly as herbs were sorted. The apothecary moved deliberately, arranging bundles and inspecting tiny leaves. Occasionally, a mouse scuttled across the floor, and he paused to watch it disappear under a shelf. Outside, the wind lifted a few petals from nearby flowers, sending them spinning in slow arcs before they settled gently on the ground. By the riverbank, the fisherman tended his nets. Each knot was tied with care, each rope adjusted slowly. The water flowed past silently, ripples spreading in concentric circles. A small bird landed on a rock nearby, watching him with tilted head, then hopped away without a sound. The boat rocked softly, tied to its post, moving in time with the gentle current. Children wandered the streets, carrying baskets or helping their parents with small chores. Each step was deliberate. A girl paused to watch a cat chase a shadow, then continued her walk. A boy lingered at the river's edge, tossing small pebbles in sequence, listening to the faint splash each one made. The rhythm of their movements blended with the soft murmur of village life, a slow symphony of calm repetition. In the gardens, women tended to plants. Water was poured slowly, each leaf observed as it glistened in the sun. A man trimmed the edges of the path with careful strokes, moving deliberately along the stones. Birds hopped from branch to branch above him, chirping softly, their notes stretching into the morning air without urgency. The blacksmith opened his workshop fully now, though he did not rush. The hammer rested beside him as he adjusted tools, checked metal stock, and prepared for the slow work ahead. Each strike, when it came, was measured, not loud or jarring, just the soft rhythm of shaping metal in time with the village. Sparks flew briefly, fading instantly, leaving only the memory of motion. Even the river seemed to respond to the village. Its flow mirrored the quiet energy of Bramblewood, slow, deliberate, patient. Ducks drifted lazily on the water. Leaves fell from trees, caught by small eddies, drifting gently downstream. Every small detail mattered, yet nothing required immediate attention. The streets were filled with the subtle sounds of activity, a broom brushing against stone, a door creaking softly, a pot rattling gently on a windowsill. Each sound was part of the same unhurried rhythm, a long, continuous pattern that had existed for years, centuries perhaps. Time here moved without urgency, stretching each moment like honey dripping slowly from a spoon. By late morning, the sun had warmed rooftops and riverbanks. Smoke from chimneys curled lazily into the air. Villagers paused now and then to watch a drifting cloud, to observe a leaf flutter, to inhale the faint aroma of bread or herbs. Even in these small pauses, there was no impatience, no need to hurry. Everything was deliberate, quiet, and unremarkable. And so the morning in Bramblewood continued. The river flowed steadily, the streets were calm, the villagers worked, moved and rested and measured time. Every footstep, every gesture, every breath was part of the endless, soothing rhythm of the village. Nothing changed suddenly, nothing happened urgently. Life persisted slowly, peacefully, in the same calm, repetitive motion that defined Bramblewood. The sun stood high over Bramblewood, though its light was soft, spilling gently over rooftops, cobblestones, and the slow-moving river. The village had settled into the rhythm of the day. No one rushed. Each motion, each sound was measured, deliberate, part of the endless pattern that defined life here. In the marketplace, a few villagers arranged goods slowly. Baskets of herbs, small bundles of cloth, and jars of honey were placed carefully on tables. A woman adjusted a jar, then stepped back to inspect it from the corner of her eye. She moved methodically, ensuring nothing was out of place, though nothing would be noticed by anyone passing by. The marketplace was quiet, the clatter of trade subdued. Occasionally, a child wandered by, touching a leaf or peering curiously into a basket, then moving on. At the river, the fisherman continued his work. He untangled knots, folded them, and set them aside. Each movement was slow, precise. The water rippled gently as a leaf drifted past, and he paused to watch it float downstream before returning to his task. A duck drifted lazily nearby, lifting its head briefly to glance at the fisherman, then returning to its slow paddling. The baker, upstairs in his room, kneaded dough once more. The flour dust rose in faint clouds, shimmering slightly in the midday light. He worked carefully, folding and pressing, pausing every so often to observe the texture and weight of the dough. Outside the window, a cat stretched on the ledge, moving slowly as if aware that the day was meant to be unhurried. Children wandered through the streets and along the riverbank, carrying small baskets of herbs or flowers. They moved deliberately, often pausing to watch an insect crawl across a leaf or a bird land on a branch. Their footsteps were soft, measured, blending into the quiet rhythm of the village. Sometimes a small laugh would escape, gentle and brief, fading quickly into the surrounding calm. In the gardens, women continued their careful chores. Water dripped slowly onto the soil, leaves were examined one by one, tiny blossoms were arranged in neat clusters, petals counted and adjusted. The wind moved softly, stirring the plants without a hurry. A rabbit hopped through the grass, careful with each step, pausing to sniff the earth, then continuing on its measured path. The blacksmith struck the anvil occasionally, though not with urgency. Sparks flew briefly and disappeared. Each hammering motion was precise, part of the rhythm that stretched across the village. The sound was steady, neither sharp nor loud, blending into the soft chorus of mid-morning. Rustling leaves, flowing water, quiet footsteps on cobblestone. By the river bridge, a few villagers paused to observe the water. A man traced a stick along the surface, creating tiny ripples. A child leaned over the edge, tossing pebbles one by one, listening to the subtle splashes. A cat watched them both, blinking slowly before curling into a ball on the railing. Everything moved slowly, without urgency, and everything was observed with patience. As the sun continued its journey across the sky, shadows shifted gradually. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, curling and twisting in the light breeze. Leaves swayed gently in the trees. Every small motion, every faint sound, every measured breath was part of Bramblewood's unbroken rhythm. Time passed unnoticed, stretching each moment into eternity. Even the smallest gestures, the turning of a page in a book, the smoothing of a cloth, the rolling of a wheel in preparation, carried weight and care. Nothing was sudden, nothing demanded attention, and in the deliberate monotony of midday, Bramblewood thrived quietly, comfortably, endlessly. By mid-afternoon, the village had settled fully into the day's pace. Tasks repeated themselves, small interactions occurred without excitement, and every person, animal, and object moved with the same measured patience. The river continued to flow, the wind whispered through the trees, and life carried on in its endless hypnotic rhythm. The sun began its slow descent once more, painting the village in pale golden hues. Shadows stretched across the streets, touching the cobblestones, fences, and rooftops with long, gentle lines. Bramblewood moved at its usual unhurried pace. Every sound, every movement carried a deliberate calm, as though the day itself was breathing slowly and deeply. In the bakery, the baker placed freshly kneaded dough into trays. He worked carefully, measuring each piece with precision. The faint smell of flour and yeast lingered in the warm air. He paused occasionally, watching the sunlight shift across the wooden counter, noting how it made small specks of dust sparkle. Nothing in the bakery demanded hurry. Every gesture was slow, considered, and repeated with patient care. By the river, the fisherman began to fold his nets once again. His movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. Each knot was untied and retied with care. Water lapped softly against the boat, creating faint ripples that spread slowly and vanished. A heron stood near the riverbank, motionless, observing the water. It did not move quickly. It did not need to. The rhythm of Bramblewood extended even to the creatures that shared it. Children wandered more freely now, moving along the streets and through gardens. Some paused to examine insects on leaves. Others watched the river's surface, tossing tiny pebbles with gentle care. Their laughter was soft, deliberate, and fleeting, blending into the quiet sounds of late afternoon, the rustle of leaves, the soft creak of doors, the occasional clink of a tool. In the gardens, women tended plants with meticulous attention. Water dripped from small clay pots, soaking the soil drop by drop. Leaves were adjusted, blossoms inspected, herbs gathered and placed carefully into baskets. The wind moved lazily through the trees, shaking branches just enough to make the sunlight dance across leaves. A rabbit hopped through the grass, pausing occasionally to sniff the earth, then continuing on its slow path. The blacksmith worked intermittently, striking metal with soft, measured blows. Sparks danced briefly before fading. Each strike echoed gently across the empty streets. He paused often, wiping sweat from his brow, watching the motion of the river and listening to the distant hum of village life. There was no urgency. Each hammering motion became part of the slow pulse of Bramblewood. Villagers paused in the late afternoon to notice small details. A man watched a leaf float in a puddle. A woman listened to the distant sound of the river against the river bank. Children examined the pattern of shadows cast by the trees. Even the air seemed slower, heavier with the warmth of sunlight filtered through leaves, carrying the faint smell of herbs, bread, and damp earth. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, curling gently toward the sky. The soft wind moved over rooftops and fences, carrying faint, unremarkable sounds: the creak of a door, the rustle of a broom, the subtle flap of a bird's wing. Every movement was deliberate, every sound part of the continuous, patient rhythm of the village. By late afternoon, the light softened further. The sun's warmth lingered, touching rooftops, walls, and the river in muted gold. Shadows stretched long, curling softly around trees and stones. The village seemed to pause for a moment, holding its breath, savoring the slow, deliberate rhythm of life. Nothing was rushed. Nothing demanded attention. Time in Bramblewood was endless, measured, and patient. And so the late afternoon passed quietly. The river flowed, birds moved gently from branch to branch, and villagers went about their repetitive tasks. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to the calm, hypnotic pattern that defined Bramblewood. Life continued deliberately, unhurriedly, endlessly, in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. The sun had begun its gentle descent behind the hills, painting the sky in muted shades of orange, pink, and gray. Light stretched across Bramblewood in soft, fading patterns, turning cobblestones, rooftops, and riverbanks into calm surfaces of gold and shadow. The village moved slowly, deliberately, as though the fading light itself commanded patience. In the bakery, the baker cleaned his workspace. Each bowl, each tray, each utensil was washed with careful attention. Water dripped from the sponges in small, measured streams, landing quietly in the sink. Flour dust lingered in the warm evening air, shimmering faintly in the last rays of sunlight. He paused often, breathing slowly, observing the gentle shift of shadows across the walls. Nothing demanded hurry. Nothing required urgency. At the river, the fisherman secured his boat for the night. Each knot was tied with care, each rope adjusted slowly. The water lapped gently against the riverbank, carrying small floating leaves downstream. A heron stood silently, wings folded, watching. Occasionally, the bird shifted its weight, then returned to stillness. The rhythm of Bramblewood extended even to its wildlife, slow, deliberate, endless. Children moved quietly through the streets, finishing small tasks or helping parents. One paused to watch a cat stretch in the sunlight before curling up on a windowsill. Another observed the way a leaf floated on the river's surface. Their footsteps were soft, deliberate, measured. Even their laughter, when it came, was muted and brief, fading quickly into the calm evening. In the gardens, water dripped from clay pots onto soil, soaking each plant slowly. Women adjusted herbs, counted blossoms, and carefully collected leaves. The wind brushed gently against trees, moving branches softly, letting leaves dance for only a moment before settling. A rabbit hopped across the garden path, pausing once to sniff the earth, then continuing its careful journey. The blacksmith had stuffed work for the day. He rested on a bench, leaning back and watching the village move at its unhurried pace. Sparks from earlier work had faded entirely, leaving only the memory of motion. He listened to the river, the soft murmur of the wind, the quiet shuffle of villagers passing by. Time here was patient. Time was slow. Every action, no matter how small, mattered, yet nothing was urgent. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, curling into the pale sky. Windows glowed faintly with candlelight, casting gentle reflections onto the streets. Shadows stretched long and soft, embracing the village in quiet patterns. Every motion, every gesture, every breath was part of Bramblewood's endless rhythm. Even the air seemed slower in the twilight, moving carefully between houses, trees, and the river. Villagers paused occasionally, noticing small details. A man adjusted a roof tile, taking care to align it perfectly. A woman lingered at her doorway, watching the river shimmer in the fading light. Children crouched briefly to examine a flower or a small insect, then continued slowly on their path. Each gesture repeated, deliberate, insignificant in urgency, yet comforting in its constancy. As the sun continued to sink, the light softened to a muted glow, touching every surface with gentle warmth. The river reflected the dimming sky, ripples moving so slowly they almost seemed to pause. The village exhaled, quietly, deliberately, preparing for the calm of night. Nothing moved too fast, nothing broke the rhythm. Bramblewood's day transitioned without drama, without hurry, without excitement. And so twilight passed. Shadows lengthened, smoke drifted lazily, water flowed gently, and life continued in its slow, hypnotic pattern. The villagers finished their small chores, animals settled, and the air itself seemed to slow, moving with the deliberate calm that defined Bramblewood. Each day approached its end, but nothing truly ended. The rhythm of life continued, soft, unbroken, endless. Night had fully arrived over Bramblewood. The sun had disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the village bathed in soft moonlight. Shadows stretched long across rooftops and streets, curling gently around fences, trees, and cobblestones. The river reflected the pale glow of the moon, shimmering faintly, carrying the endless rhythm of the village into the quiet night. In the smallest cottages, candles flickered gently, casting slow-moving shadows across walls and floors. Villagers moved through their homes deliberately, performing small tasks, smoothing blankets, adjusting pots, stacking firewood. Each gesture was slow, careful, and repeated with gentle precision. Nothing was urgent, nothing demanded haste. The baker, having finished the last of his work, leaned back in a chair beside a small window. The faint smell of bread lingered in the room. He watched a moth flutter past the candlelight, moving softly in lazy arcs before disappearing into the darkness. Outside, smoke drifted from chimneys in thin curls, vanishing into the cool night air. By the river, the fisherman's boat rested quietly, tied securely to its post. The water flowed gently, carrying tiny ripples across the surface. A heron stood near the bank, wings folded, motionless, watching the moonlight. Occasionally, a small fish disturbed the surface, sending concentric waves across the calm river. The fisherman rested nearby, eyes half closed, listening to the soft murmur of water and wind, letting the day's work settle into memory. Children lay in their beds, their small breaths soft and steady. Some dreamed of rivers, trees, or drifting leaves. Others dreamed of simple patterns, stones along the river, petals on the wind, the soft flutter of animals moving through the village. Parents watched quietly, smoothing blankets, listening, and returning to their own rest. Every movement was deliberate, slow, and calming, adding to the rhythm of Bramblewood. In the gardens, dew settled on leaves and flowers. Water dripped slowly from small clay pots, soaking the soil drop by drop. A rabbit moved softly through the grass, pausing briefly to sniff the earth before continuing its careful journey. Wind brushed through the trees, rustling leaves in measured motions, creating a gentle chorus that echoed through the silent village. The blacksmith rested outside his workshop, leaning against the wooden bench. His hammer lay beside him, silent and still. He listened to the faint creak of a door, the soft flow of the river, and the occasional flutter of a bird settling in the trees. Each sound was magnified in the stillness of night, part of the unhurried rhythm of Bramblewood. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, the faint scent of herbs and baked bread lingering in the cool air. Windows glowed softly, reflecting quiet domestic life. A hand smoothing a blanket, a candle flame flickering, a small animal curling into sleep. The village exhaled slowly, deliberately, its heartbeat measured and calm. As the night deepened, the river flowed silently, the wind whispered softly through the trees, and the villagers rested in deliberate peace. Nothing happened suddenly, nothing demanded attention. Each small motion was part of the continuous, unbroken rhythm of Bramblewood. And so the village slept. Every stone, every tree, every ripple of the river became part of the hypnotic, slow pattern of life. The moon traced its path across the sky, the night held the village in gentle stillness, and the endless days continued, soft, unhurried, unbroken, and eternal. Before the first light of the sun touched the hills, Bramblewood lay in deep, hushed stillness. The river flowed softly, carrying the faint reflection of stars in its glassy surface. Mist hovered over the water, curling and twisting lazily, almost as if it too were sleeping, unwilling to disturb the village's calm. In the smallest cottages, candles flickered gently, casting slow-moving shadows across walls and floors. Villagers moved through their homes deliberately, performing small tasks, smoothing blankets, adjusting pots, stacking firewood. Each gesture was slow, careful, and repeated with gentle precision. Nothing was urgent, nothing demanded haste. The baker, having finished the last of his work, leaned back in a chair beside a small window. The faint smell of bread lingered in the room. He watched a moth flutter past the candlelight, moving softly in lazy arcs before disappearing into the darkness. Outside, smoke drifted from chimneys in thin curls, vanishing into the cool night air. By the river, the fisherman's boat rested quietly, tied securely to its post. The water flowed gently, carrying tiny ripples across the surface. A heron stood near the bank, wings folded, motionless, watching the moonlight. Occasionally, a small fish disturbed the surface, sending concentric waves across the calm river. The fisherman rested nearby, eyes half closed, listening to the soft murmur of water and wind, letting the day's work settle into memory. Children lay in their beds, their small breaths soft and steady. Some dreamed of rivers, trees, or drifting leaves. Others dreamed of simple patterns, stones along the river, petals on the wind, the soft flutter of animals moving through the village. Parents watched quietly, smoothing blankets, listening, and returning to their own rest. Every movement was deliberate, slow, and calming, adding to the rhythm of Bramblewood. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, the faint scent of herbs and baked bread lingering in the cool air. Windows glowed softly, reflecting quiet domestic life. A hand smoothing a blanket, a candle flame flickering, a small animal curling into sleep. The village exhaled slowly, deliberately, its heartbeat measured and calm. As the night deepened, the river flowed silently, the wind whispered softly through the trees, and the villagers rested in deliberate peace. Nothing happened suddenly, nothing demanded attention. Each small motion was part of the continuous, unbroken rhythm of Bramblewood. And so the village slept. Every stone, every tree, every ripple of the river became part of the hypnotic, slow pattern of life. The moon traced its path across the sky, the night held the village in gentle stillness, and the endless days continued, soft, unhurried, unbroken, and eternal. Before the first light of the sun touched the hills, Bramblewood lay in deep, hushed stillness. The river flowed softly, carrying the faint reflection of stars in its glassy surface. Mist hovered over the water, curling and twisting lazily, almost as if it too were sleeping, unwilling to disturb the village's calm. In the smallest cottages, candles flickered gently, casting slow-moving shadows across walls and floors. Villagers moved through their homes deliberately, performing small tasks, smoothing blankets, adjusting pots, stacking firewood. Each gesture was slow, careful, and repeated with gentle precision. Nothing was urgent, nothing demanded haste. The baker, having finished the last of his work, leaned back in a chair beside a small window. The faint smell of bread lingered in the room. He watched a moth flutter past the candlelight, moving softly in lazy arcs before disappearing into the darkness. Outside, smoke drifted from chimneys in thin curls, vanishing into the cool night air. By the river, the fisherman's boat rested quietly, tied securely to its post. The water flowed gently, carrying tiny ripples across the surface. A heron stood near the bank, wings folded, motionless, watching the moonlight. Occasionally, a small fish disturbed the surface, sending concentric waves across the calm river. The fisherman rested nearby, eyes half closed, listening to the soft murmur of water and wind, letting the day's work settle into memory. Children lay in their beds, their small breaths soft and steady. Some dreamed of rivers, trees, or drifting leaves. Others dreamed of simple patterns, stones along the river, petals on the wind, the soft flutter of animals moving through the village. Parents watched quietly, smoothing blankets, listening, and returning to their own rest. Every movement was deliberate, slow, and calming, adding to the rhythm of Bramblewood. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, the faint scent of herbs and baked bread lingering in the cool air. Windows glowed softly, reflecting quiet. The sun had dipped low behind the distant hills, casting a soft orange and pink glow across Bramblewood. Shadows stretched long and gentle over rooftops, fences, gardens, and cobblestone streets. The village moved deliberately, each person attending to small tasks in measured, careful motions. Nothing was rushed, nothing required urgency. Every moment lingered in slow, unbroken rhythm. In the bakery, the baker wiped counters and arranged trays. Each utensil was set down with care, every surface brushed gently. Water dripped slowly from sponges, landing in the sink with quiet, measured plinks. Flour dust floated lazily in the air, drifting in thin clouds before settling. He paused occasionally, observing the fading light through the window, breathing in time with the deliberate rhythm of the day. At the river, the fisherman tied his boat securely and coiled his nets. The water rippled softly, carrying small leaves downstream. A heron stood near the bank, motionless, watching the river in silence. A fish broke the surface with a faint circle that expanded and vanished slowly. The fisherman paused, watching, letting the river's calmness settle over him before returning to his quiet tasks. Children wandered along streets and through gardens, finishing chores or assisting parents. One paused to watch a butterfly flutter along the fence. Another tossed small pebbles into the river, listening to the soft, gentle splashes. Their movements were deliberate, careful, blending with the village's slow, unhurried rhythm. Occasionally, soft laughter escaped, brief and muted, quickly absorbed by the calm of evening. In the gardens, women watered plants with careful attention. Water dripped slowly from clay pots, soaking soil drop by drop. Leaves were adjusted, blossoms examined, and herbs gathered into baskets. A rabbit moved softly along the garden paths, pausing once to sniff the earth, then continuing its slow, careful journey. The wind stirred branches lazily, moving leaves in subtle, deliberate motions before settling. The blacksmith had finished work for the day. He leaned against his bench, resting and observing the village. His hammer lay beside him, still. He listened to the soft rustle of leaves, the gentle flow of the river, and the faint creak of doors. Each sound, each motion, was part of Bramblewood's endless, hypnotic rhythm. Smoke drifted slowly from chimneys, curling into the dimming sky. Windows glowed faintly with candlelight, reflecting quiet domestic life. A hand smoothing a blanket, a pot placed carefully on a shelf, a small animal settling down. The village exhaled slowly, deliberately, in harmony with the rhythm of day moving into night. As the sun disappeared completely behind the hills, light softened to a gentle gray, fading into the calm of twilight. Shadows lengthened, wrapping streets and gardens in slow patterns. Villagers paused occasionally to observe small changes, leaves shifting in the breeze, ripples on the river, the slow drift of smoke from a chimney. Every gesture, no matter how small, contributed to the deliberate, unbroken rhythm of the village. And so the evening unfolded. The river flowed gently, wind whispered through trees, and villagers moved slowly, deliberately, and endlessly. Each step, each motion, each breath became part of Bramblewood's hypnotic pattern. Nothing happened suddenly. Nothing demanded haste. Time stretched slowly, deliberately, unbroken and eternal. Night had fully settled over Bramblewood. The last traces of sunlight had vanished behind distant hills, leaving the village bathed in soft moonlight. Shadows stretched long and gentle across rooftops, fences, gardens, and streets. The river reflected the faint glow of the moon, rippling slowly and quietly, carrying the rhythm of the village into darkness. Inside cottages, villagers moved quietly, finishing small evening tasks. Candles flickered softly, casting long shadows across walls and floors. Every motion, smoothing a blanket, placing a pot on a shelf, adjusting a small chair, was deliberate and measured. Nothing was urgent, nothing demanded haste. Each movement stretched out in time, blending seamlessly into the calm, unbroken rhythm of Bramblewood. The baker leaned back in his chair, watching the moonlight shimmer across the counter. Flour dust hung gently in the air, drifting slowly in the soft light. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled, allowing the rhythm of the night to settle over him. Outside, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, disappearing slowly into the cool night air. The fisherman had returned to his cottage. His boat rested quietly by the riverbank, tied securely. The water flowed softly, ripples carrying leaves and petals downstream. A heron stood motionless at the river's edge, wings folded, observing the quiet. Occasionally, a small fish broke the surface, sending faint circles across the water, which faded slowly into the calm. The fisherman paused, watching, letting the river's calmness settle over him before returning to his quiet tasks. Children lay in their beds, breathing slowly and in steady patterns. Some dreamed of rivers and trees, others imagined drifting leaves, petals in the wind, or animals moving carefully through the village. Parents watched quietly, smoothing blankets, listening to the faint sounds of the night. Every small movement, every subtle sound became part of the hypnotic, unhurried rhythm of Bramblewood. In the gardens, dew settled on leaves and flowers. Water dripped slowly from clay pots onto soil and plants. Rabbits moved softly along the paths, pausing briefly before continuing their careful journeys. The wind brushed through branches, making leaves sway briefly before settling once more. Every movement was deliberate, small, yet part of the continuous rhythm of the village. The blacksmith rested outside, leaning against his bench. His hammer lay still, quiet, and unused. He listened to the faint murmur of the river, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional creak of doors in cottages. Each sound, each stretched gently across the night, part of the calm, hypnotic pattern that defined life in Bramblewood. Smoke drifted slowly from chimneys, curling upward into the dark sky. Windows glowed faintly with quiet domestic life, hands smoothing blankets, pots placed carefully on shelves, small animals settling to sleep. The village exhaled slowly, deliberately, in harmony with the slow rhythm of night. As the moon rose higher, shadows shifted subtly. Leaves trembled softly in the breeze, the river rippled lazily. Villagers' breathing matched the pace of the night, slow, even, and patient. Nothing happened suddenly, nothing demanded attention. Every gesture, every movement, each faint sound was absorbed into the continuous, unbroken rhythm of Bramblewood. And so the village slept. Every stone, every tree, every ripple of the river, every gentle motion of animal and human alike was part of the slow, unbroken pattern of life. The moon traced its path across the sky, the river whispered quietly, the wind moved carefully through the trees. Time stretched endlessly. Bramblewood existed in deliberate, measured repetition, unhurried and eternal. Before the first light of dawn touched the distant hills, Bramblewood lay in a deep, quiet stillness. The river flowed slowly, carrying the faint reflection of stars in its glassy surface. Mist hovered over the water, curling and drifting lazily, as though it were too lingering in sleep. The village remained almost motionless, holding its breath in the calm of pre-dawn. Inside cottages, villagers stirred gently. A blanket rustled softly. Breaths rose and fell in steady, measured patterns. The baker rolled over, stretching his arms above his head, inhaling the faint smell of bread left from the day before. The blacksmith shifted on his bench, stretching carefully without rising. Children turned in their beds, eyes half closed, dreaming quietly. Every movement, no matter how small, was part of endless rhythm of Bramblewood. The river rippled faintly. A leaf drifted across the surface, carried slowly downstream. A heron stood motionless on the river's bank, wings folded, observing the quiet.